again, thank you so much, Jane, for agreeing to have a chat today. I think I encountered your work maybe a few months ago,
Mm.
and I was like immediately fascinated by and felt a sort of deep resonance, strangely, with our work, like with the Demidov work. And I just thought it would be wonderful to learn a bit more about what you do and a little bit about your background. You are a Jungian psychoanalyst
Mhm.
and have a very interesting and diverse background in movement therapy and somatic work and acting. And that you developed something that you called Jungian somatics, which is super interesting as far as I understand it, right? If you wouldn't mind just giving us some information about your background, where you came
Sure.
from, and also what your path was to the work that you're doing now.
Where to start? Well, I didn't have an intellectual understanding of Jung's work before I started my training as a Jungian analyst. I'd had years of Jungian analysis without understanding any of the theory. So when I started my training, it was really bringing the theory on top of the experience, I would say. I have a history, like a complex trauma history, that has been really challenging in many ways. And I found Jungian analysis the most depathologizing way of approaching who I am in the world. And I found a Jungian analyst who was also very like embodied himself. So that was really helpful because the temenos, the container for the work was just inherently embodied in the way that we were sensing and feeling
Mhm.
in the work together. Um, so Jungian somatics, at first, when I started my training, I thought I'd have to weave somatics into Jung's work.
Mhm.
Just in, even in the way that we were learning in my training program, but the years that I spent kind of sitting and immersing and marinating in his work, it's deeply embodied. Jung was a deeply embodied human being, you know,
Mhm.
um, and so it's just all there. And
Mhm.
and really see this relationship between psyche and soma as in,
Mhm.
as inseparable. There's not an intersection. It's just completely inseparable. It's just
Interesting.
it's just there. But our cultural complexes and our relationship with the body has had it been sort of parked to the side. And now, as the body's being brought back into trauma work, and it's almost like the body's now being edified. And I'm like, wait, I just did a talk with the Austin Young Society last night, trying to like really bring people into a deeper understanding of the complexity of the body and the
Mhm.
complexity of relating to the body. Because that's
Mhm.
really my journey. And the way I grew up, I found movement when I was about 15. And it was old school aerobics with like music, which is deeply, I read a quote back from Oliver Sacks that music is sort of the closest thing to telepathy that we have. So
Mhm.
being in spaces with people moving together in coordinated rhythm, and it was just I think it really kind of saved my life, my soul, perhaps you could say,
Mhm.
if you
Mhm.
believe you have such a thing. But then there's always the tension of opposites too, and that's
Mhm.
really deeply based in kind of Jung's understanding of psyche and the
Mhm.
universe in general. It flipped into overexercise and food restriction.
Right.
um, yeah. And then I was like, I'm going to get on this train and I know where I'm going. And so I jumped into business school and I worked in the corporate world in HR and labor relations. And I fired my first employee at Molson Breweries when I was 23 years old. And it was terrible. And I was good at what I did. I remember I got my head bitten off in a strategic planning meeting because I was really interested in interest-based conflict resolution, which is basically relational conflict resolution. And so I sort of corrected the director and
Oh,
she really put me in my place. And I remember my manager came to me afterwards and he was like, if you want to do this work, you're going to have to get better at hiding what you're thinking and feeling.
God.
And I'm like, no way. I did that my whole childhood.
Hmm.
I'm not going to do this now. So there was this leaving that behind, which took a lot of courage because I left behind security, money, a growing career. And I moved to Toronto with my then partner. And I'm like, what am I going to do with myself?
Mm.
And um, somehow I was guided into places and meeting people that cracked open my creativity again. I was a very creative child, like very creative. But that, as we know, like the creative instinct gets really pinched off when we're dealing with pretty intense trauma
Yeah.
that is not really resourced and supported.
Yeah.
And so I worked through Julia Cameron's book religiously after I moved to Toronto, and it's called The Artist's Way.
Hmm.
Um, and that was years ago. That was like the late 90s. I couldn't go back. There was
Hmm.
just no going back. And
Hmm.
so I eventually somehow found myself in my first acting class. And then I had one-on-one acting coaching, and it felt like I was just being cracked open, you
Hmm.
know,
Hmm.
just for accessing a part of myself that I had to put away and repress in order to kind of feel normal and have what I thought was going to be a stable and secure life.
Did it feel a positive cracking open? Did it feel like it was revealing something, or was it
Yeah,
difficult?
it was challenging. Like I had to deal with a lot of people, like a mentor from business school or other people who thought I lost my mind. Why would I leave behind like a burgeoning career and all the work I'd done? Um, because I was doing really well. I was kind of the youngest hired into any position I'd had up to that point, and
Hmm.
so that was really hard. But it was inevitable. I couldn't even put whether it was good or bad. It was just inevitable. It's like my self with a capital S or soul was just like, you have to be here.
Hmm.
Um, and then shortly after that, I had a really difficult autoimmune disease that almost took my life.
Oh,
And yeah, and so it was almost like that full, what Jung calls the descent into the dark,
yeah.
into a more existential awareness about life in general.
Mhm.
Um, that I think helped me get deeper in touch with that part of me that wanted to create my life differently. I had done some, teaching, movement teaching or aerobics and stuff teaching, and I just moved back into like being a movement coach for a while as a stopgap. But then I don't know if I was a great actor, but I did find a lot of freedom in European clowning and creating a character and doing solo sketch comedy with a very fallible character,
Hmm.
um, earnest and fallible character that um, just was really, I don't know, was very enlivening. And
Clowning is amazing like that in terms of being able to reveal your vulnerability, right? And your willingness to reveal it. Hmm.
exactly. And it was just that feeling like I'd already known I really like to move people. Like there was a part of me that just knew I wanted to move people somehow. And so that feeling, of being sometimes open mic nights and it's just like going terribly and that really painful experience. And then those other moments where you can feel there was almost like tapping into this energetic collective of being together.
Yeah.
And yeah, it was just really, really great. But eventually I just became a full-time movement coach after I had my daughter. And I
Hmm.
just didn't want to go to shitty auditions for like Tim Hortons, which is like a coffee shop,
Right.
and babysitter and go to cattle calls for commercial auditions. And I'm like,
Hmm.
So I moved into full-time movement coaching, personal training at the time, and
Hmm.
then I had my own a few studios for a while. And the more I worked with the body, because I did some touch work, table work, strength and mobility coaching with people in really deep suffering. And I realized I could pull all this stuff up from the body, but everybody needed their own therapist because it was out of my scope of practice. So I
Right.
could pull up all this stuff from the unconscious. And then I'd have to be like, well, take it to your therapist.
Yeah.
And honestly, there's not a lot of therapists who are really trained to deal with those deeper somatic states
Hmm.
beyond just nervous system regulation work.
Hmm.
So I was really encouraged by my analyst to apply for the training and it I did, and it was very smooth. Like I knew I was in the right place.
Hmm. And it's a
And
big commitment, right? Because it's a long training.
well, it's a long training. The training can be up to 8 to 10 years, but I got through it in 4.
Wow.
And I got through it faster, not because I was trying to prove something. It was just the energy. It
Hmm.
was just carrying me through,
Hmm.
especially because I didn't have an intellectual understanding of the training to begin with. But I was just really well supported. I had an incredible supervisor when I got into clinical work who's based in the UK, Birgit Hewer, who is like quantum level somatics. And so, yeah, I've had really good teachers my whole life.
Hmm.
Like, I've been so lucky with the
Hmm.
teachers I've had throughout
Yeah,
my life.
which is amazing. I mean, great teachers make all the difference. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what led you to create Jungian somatics and what it actually is.
Oh God. Well, Jungian somatics, I would say, bridges like Jungian theory, but through experience, like very deeply embodied experience, a lot through the felt sense. And there's
Hmm.
pillars of Jungian somatics that I'm kind of consistently evolving.
Hmm.
Active imagination is a huge part of it,
Hmm.
but with like a very somatic orientation, it can involve like intuitive and spontaneous movement that isn't like authentic movement. It wouldn't, because I also use music. I think music is really powerful for evoking feeling, emotion, affect, and moving us, like
Hmm.
having that experience of something else moving us, I
Yeah.
think is really powerful. So music is like it's always been a huge part of my life. It's like water.
Hmm.
Um, then I really look at transference and countertransference, like so, but from a somatic standpoint. Uh, Kind of, I call it the Jungian somatics dream method. So it takes traditional Jungian dream analysis and
Hmm.
brings in and kind of leans it into the body a lot more, which is really helpful for people overcoming more pernicious trauma.
Hmm.
Because dreams can kind of provide a shield, like with Perseus
Hmm.
looking directly at Medusa, which is really great.
Hmm.
A lot of spontaneous drawing, which is really helpful because it gets into the deepest layer of the unconscious.
Hmm.
So an artist, a trained artist can do spontaneous drawing and their pictures are just going to look like a 3-year-old's, it's
Yeah, yeah,
fantastic,
yeah,
you know? Yeah.
yeah.
I also explore sexuality, which isn't a topic that's really been deeply explored in the Jungian world in many ways, kind of peripherally, but it seems like it needs to really be brought back in. And
Interesting.
the neurobiology of the creative instinct is a huge part of my work as well, because it feels like it leads us, like the creativity connects us to soul or self. These are the different aspects, but I had trained for many practitioners and therapists for years in a professional training program called Movement for Trauma. And I developed that and taught that for many years. So I was
Hmm.
already very used to offering training programs and holding space for practitioners, and some lay people as well. And then it was just natural,
Yeah,
the development of Jungian somatics. Yeah, it just evolved without
yeah,
me pushing it forward.
yeah. And it
Yeah.
sounds like it's still evolving, right? That you are still, it's a constant process.
Always. Yeah, it's that ability to like experiment and fail, which
Hmm.
is, I mean, we could tie that to European clowning, or
Hmm.
it's failing, it's flopping, it's trying things. I have a lot of courage to try things out and fail. And so
Hmm.
and move on, you know?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I saw a quote by Jung in something that it was on some of your material somewhere, which I was fascinated by, which was I have to read it here. From the living foundation of instinct flows everything that is creative. Hence, the unconscious is not merely conditioned by history, but is the
Mm.
very source of the creative impulse.
Yes.
When I read that, I had to do a double take because I immediately felt this is something that Demidov could have written. This the source of our creativity. And I wonder if you could just speak to that quote a little bit in terms of your understanding in your own work and your own experience of having worked with people about that connection to the source of the creative impulse, because I'm sure it's a deep part of what you do, right?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I did resonate a lot with your work and the Demidov method. And I was like, oh my God, it felt so inherently similar in some ways.
Yeah, I had
Yeah.
that feeling also. Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, before I was a Jungian analyst, I had a studio, movement studio in an area of Toronto that has tons of creatives from filmmakers to, um, experimental videographers to, people who are just creating and in creative roles. And so our work would inherently support them in their work. And I was really helping people become more in touch with their physical body and rooting in their physical body and connecting with sensation, connecting with learning new movement capacity, diversifying their movement abilities, all those things. And it just seemed like it was really supportive for them in their work as well. I've
Hmm.
worked with people, novelists from the beginning of a novel to an end as a
Wow.
movement coach, right? And
I'm,
I had one
Mhm.
novelist say it's like writing a novel fiction for them was like a full contact sport, meaning their whole body was involved in the process.
Absolutely. Yeah. Wow. Amazing.
And
Yeah.
I've worked with lots of actors over the years, currently and past, and people who, especially the ones who went through theater school. Actually,
Mm-hmm.
one of my clients for a while, I can say this because they were personal training, not an analysis client, was
Hmm.
I stepped on Bertolt Brecht's granddaughter's glasses during a session. So I broke his granddaughter's glasses, so oh,
Talk about
um,
symbolism.
yeah, I know. I know. So I was just in that world. Like, and when my daughter was with her dad, I would get invited to so many interesting creative experiences and events in the city. I'd be like, yes, yes, it's just in my bones. So,
Mm-hmm.
that's a long answer to your question, but I do think the physical body can be sort of a conduit
Hmm.
for the creative instinct. Things
Hmm.
come through the physical body, through to the subtle body, through to, you
Yeah,
know, it seems kind of obvious. Like when you think about a good theater training program, it really is dropping people into their physical body, right?
it is. Yeah. It's just unfortunate that we are kind of in many drama schools, right? The Stanislavskian tradition is still pretty dominant in all of its permutations. And we see the actors who come from that work to ours, how kind of bound they are because they're in a kind of, we're kind of living in this cycle of analysis that, the Stanislavskian kind of impulses that we can will ourselves through our conscious will, we can will ourselves to want something or feel something or do something. And the kind of need to control, be in control of every moment. And the fact that, we are constantly taught that acting is doing, and you have to know what you're doing in every moment.
Mm.
And my question around that is always, do we? Why? Do we know what we're doing in every moment in life? Aren't we just surrendering moment to moment to what is arising? And this is where kind of it somehow reminds me of Jung's relationship to Freud, right? Demidov's relation
Mm.
to Stanislavski, because Demidov was a trained psychiatrist, but also a serious yoga practitioner and also, very interested, serious student of certain esoteric practices, both Eastern and Western. And he was kind of bringing all of this to bear when he started to break away from Stanislavski and develop his own work. And it's an interesting thing, right? That why that quote I just read resonates so much because the difference between them was that Demidov was saying from day one, the actor should be taken straight to the subconscious, straight to subconscious creativity, rather than, as Stanislavski was doing, thinking that you can break the creative process into separate elements and teach them individually and then say, now put it all together.
What I
Yeah.
sense is like the difference between Demidov and Stanislavski might be that it's the idea that you're pulling only from your own personal experience. But when I think of the Demidov method, I think it kind of lines up with Jung's model of the psyche, which includes a layer of the unconscious called the collective unconscious, where
Yes.
archetypes live and
Yes.
archetypes are universal to any species, to humans. So there's so many, there's an endless number of archetypes that extend beyond our personal experience. And when
Absolutely.
I think of artists, artists are actually often communicating archetypal images through symbol. It could be movement, it could be words. Words are symbol too, but you're accessing these endless possibilities
Yes.
that come through you
Yeah.
versus choosing to access kind of more a personal level of experience. Am I
Abs-
right? Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. That we are kind of dropping material in the first instance, the material being the text, dropping these words into a much deeper place and allowing them and learning to surrender to what arises rather
Mhm.
than making choices, which is almost now a religion in acting, right? I make a good choice, a bad choice, a strong choice. But in our work, we say there are no choices. There are only inevitabilities.
Mm.
Something arises and I surrender to it or I don't. How is that a choice, right? A choice kind of implies that where am I when I make a choice? I'm in my head. And that's
You're an egoic control.
exactly, and that's not where we live as actors, or at least not where we ideally could be living. And
Mhm.
so in our work, we are learning more and more to give in to get out of our own way, and to learn not to do, but not to do nothing.
So
And
like Jung would call that abaissement du niveau mental, like which is the process of active imagination means letting go of psychic restraints.
right,
So so in that quote, where Jung was basically saying, yes, the unconscious is personal experience, memories, repression of those of many things, but the unconscious is also a place where things are being born and coming into being.
yes,
Like there's this sort of
yes,
there's a fountain, a life-giving fountain in the unconscious as well that could be also transpersonal, right? It could be a transpersonal kind of I've heard one Jungian call it the energetic collective, right? That you
hmm
tap into. And
hmm
so it's that if you can let go of psychic restraints, then there's this unconscious, this is one of my teachers called this unconscious competence that can emerge.
That's so interesting. It's so interesting because it resonates so deeply with what Demidov was also teaching, right? That the genius of what he created was that very gradually, almost imperceptibly, leading the actor towards letting go more and more of those restraints because it can be frightening, right? One of the things that when actors first come to this work, if
Mhm.
they've been trained, let's say, in one of the permutations of Stanislavski, is that they have to know what they're doing in every moment. They have to know what they're about to play. And what we are asking them to do is to not do that. And then there is this kind of looming, terrifying, unforeseen, right? The fear of being empty, the fear of nothingness, the fear of the void. But of course, that's nonsense because there is no such thing as nature abhors a vacuum, right? So as soon as I let go of my need to control, I allow all of that life to enter. I allow all of that flow to start to flow through me, that life that you just spoke about, right? And then we are kind of living authentically and not in a premeditated way. But he does it very slowly, right? With learning, first of all, to surrender to the most banal, mundane things. And
Mm,
slowly, slowly, like learning to walk on a tightrope, 2 inches from the ground first with supports. And then
mm.
slowly that rope gets higher and higher until I, with absolute faith, know that I can run and cartwheel across that line, and I'm absolutely going to nail it.
Can you do that yourself? Can you cartwheel across a tightrope?
Not literally, Jane, not literally.
I'm like, wow, I've done slackline training. That's really hard. But I get that. It's funny. It reminds me, I used to do flying trapeze for fun.
Oh wow.
No, I wasn't great, but I would go, they'd have these like drop-in flying trapeze nights. And I remember once I was caught. So someone caught me and I had my birthday there. It was in my late 20s. And that feeling of like that moment of letting go,
Hmm.
um, and floating in the air and knowing that that person was going to catch me. There was a net, but it's still
That's faith.
scary.
That's
Yeah,
faith.
yeah, it's faith. And it reminds me also, I rode horses for 5 years every week. I had like one-on-one riding. And it reminds me of that moment of letting go where you do all the preparation, you warm up. And there was this moment, I remember it, and it reminds me of what you're talking about, where you set the horse up, you do all the work, and then you release your hands forward, and then you have to let the horse carry you.
Hmm.
Like it's just like, and then
Hmm.
you leave the ground for a moment, and it's just like, there's
Hmm.
this level of like trust
Hmm.
and a partner in
Hmm.
that moment that was really profound, and often it was very scary, but when I would land afterwards it would almost be like a blur because I it's like I didn't dissociate, but I went somewhere
Yeah.
else where it was expanded my consciousness in those
Amazing.
moments where if I could not hold my breath, if I could, just allow, it
Hmm.
was
Hmm.
so profound. It changed me
How
really.
amazing. How amazing. And that's what a beautiful thing. What a beautiful experience. And in our work you know, we see this as well, right? There are these little moments that actors are able to do exactly that, to let go. And the more they do this work, the more those moments start to expand. And that's an absolute act of faith and trust. And Demidov has this beautiful quote where, he says that don't trust the rock that you're standing on, trust the air that you're about to jump into.
Oh, fascinating. Huh.
And that always resonated with me because there is this sense that, the actor has to fly, but we
Mm,
can't grip onto the security of what holds us up. We have to
mm,
trust the air and our ability to fly. We take
mm.
that leap and know that we are going to be caught every time because we will be.
Oh, fascinating. And that makes sense why I remembered. I'd forgotten about the flying trapeze thing first. It's not at top of mind, but it just sort of came to mind as I was sitting here with you.
Mm,
And I think of what's the symbolism of air and what's the symbolism of flying? And one aspect of that symbol is spirit.
right.
Air represents spirit,
Hmm.
right? Um,
Hmm.
and wind and being carried by
Hmm.
something, you
Hmm.
know. The wind is almost like a creature to itself. So,
It's so beautiful. And we talk a lot about faith and trust in our work, and of course those cover a huge number of possibilities. But it's really the faith. We talk about faith in building, or rather reinstilling in the actor their faith in their own talent. But
mm,
but when we talk about, which gets very easily crushed, right? One terrible word from a bad teacher, we know how easy that can be destroyed easily.
mhm,
But it's kind of more than, when we talk about talent, we are talking about the faith that there is something bigger than my tiny conscious mind or who I take myself to be.
Mm,
There are more vast forces that are working through us, which is
mm,
still us, but also not only
mhm, mhm,
that are
mhm.
working through us if we can learn to let go of the steering wheel and let something much more vast do the driving.
And that seems like that really, I was just teaching in my training program last week. And it reminds me, like, if we look at Jung's theory of archetypes, that's
Hmm.
sort of what, and archetypes have affect,
Hmm.
you know,
So
they're very,
interesting.
they're very powerful. And
Hmm.
that archetypes can be subjective as well, not just objective, but they can be like, this extends far beyond like internal family system stuff, if you know what that is. But it's
Hmm.
like archetypes can be inner personalities
Hmm.
that aren't just ours, right? There's,
Right.
yeah,
And
yeah, huh.
and here we are talking about character, right? We're
Mm-hmm.
talking about this thing that is born in me,
Mm-hmm.
born through me. And it's interesting because Demidov calls it the embryo, right? That the embryo of the character is born in the moment of transformation. And this can be quite far away from my habitual or daily persona. And I think that connects to what you're just speaking about, right? These archetypes which are not necessarily
Universal.
exactly.
Yep,
Hmm.
yep, yep. And so
Hmm.
it makes so many more possibilities. Like my first acting training was method, and I've known like method actors. And what that means is you're just pulling from your own personal experience and memory,
Yeah,
and also likely re-traumatizing yourself over and over and over.
exactly. Exactly.
And it's like I've done recovery work with people after they've like when I was a movement coach in particular, after they finished a role, and I'm like, whoa, this person needs to get pulled back together somehow because they're walking over those really intense personal memories, neural pathways, and
Yeah.
more deeply grooving in that suffering. And I'm
Yeah.
like, and then they can be so dysregulated
Yeah.
and reactive and hard to
Dangerous.
work with even, right?
I find it dangerous and also unnecessary and a complete misunderstanding of how the creative process functions. Uh,
Mm,
I watched one very famous, let's say, method teacher. I don't like shitting on any other acting technique, right? I'm not here to do that. It's just that what I witnessed made me really angry
mm,
because it was just doing exactly what you're speaking about, re-traumatizing this poor kid.
mhm.
Um, and first of all, you are not a therapist.
Oh my
Sec
God. Oh my
second,
God. Don't even get me started on that. Sorry, go ahead.
secondly, you have no business digging into this person's personal traumas.
Yeah.
And thirdly, it's just unnecessary. If I'm thinking of my dead dog when I was 10 to make me cry and then try to transplant that into the scene, it just makes no sense because it's not coming from the circumstances of the scene, right? If I learn from day one, learn how to surrender to the circumstances, it's
Mm,
completely unnecessary for me to be digging into my personal history to try to
mhm,
make me feel something. That's what I mean
mhm.
by it's a complete misunderstanding of how our creative process functions.
And
But I
how much can you really mine that single experience for a whole career anyway, right? Like,
exactly,
yeah.
exactly.
Hmm.
And it's dangerous. It's just incredibly dangerous because a director, teacher, whoever it might be, has no idea what they're doing
Hmm. Hmm.
and no idea how to, work with that person, as you just said, right? What happens after? I'm re-traumatizing myself, and then I go away and what? I have no way of integrating that, no way of dealing with it. It's terrible.
I'm on board with that. I completely agree with that, and I'm on board with that for
Yeah.
many reasons. Hmm.
Yeah. I know that you are also an admirer of Ian McGilchrist's work.
Yes,
Um,
yes. Hmm.
And it's very interesting. And for people who may not know, Ian McGilchrist is a British psychiatrist, neuroscientist, researcher, philosopher, who spent a lot of his career researching how the different hemispheres of the brain, how to say, bring the world into being, I suppose, differently.
Hmm. Hmm.
With the the right hemisphere being comprehending, let's say, more holistically, connected more to intuition, to empathy, seeing things in context, uh,
The non-rational, really.
and the
Mm.
left being more kind of, narrowly focused, decontextualizing, categorizing, mm,
Systematizing.
exactly,
Yeah.
grasping, right? And very interesting how he speaks about, the era that we now live in, which is very left brain dominated.
Hmm.
Mm. And I find it interesting because it made a lot of sense to me in terms of what we've just been speaking about. If I put it in the context of actor training, for example, that from the time of Stanislavski, maybe even a little bit before, but he systematized it. The breaking up, the dividing, right, of the creative process, the sense of control, the sense that I can use my will to make
Hmm.
things happen. Very
Hmm.
left brain, very left brain.
It's like that seeking of certainty, right? And then
Exactly.
sometimes McGill-Chris might not agree with this, but I feel like our left hemisphere is certainty seeking and
Hmm.
more associated with logos. And then
Hmm.
our right hemisphere has a greater capacity to live with ambiguity and is more associated with eros, not just erotic eros, but like a more broad definition of eros,
Yeah.
relatedness, right?
The sense of the divine, the
Connection.
sacred.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
And so McGill-Chris would say, like, we have right hemisphere brain damage.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
I think I've heard him say that before. I'm
Yeah.
like, yeah, yeah, you know.
It's it's so true. And I wonder in your work if you notice how his work has influenced yours or what you've noticed since encountering his work in your own.
Actually, in my training program years ago, someone brought Ian McGill-Chris work in, which
Oh
was like,
wow.
yeah, I was like, oh yeah, it just makes sense. But I do find sometimes when people enter into analysis with me, they're like, how do you do what you do? And I'm like, it's an art, not a craft. Like essentially, Jungian analysis is an art. It's not a craft. I'm not duplicating a system. I'm
Hmm.
meeting an individual. I'm following their psyche. I'm
Hmm.
following their dreams. I'm following the path of their psyche. And I'm trying to listen with every cell in my body to
Hmm.
what's happening, you know,
Hmm.
observing, listening. I have a fairly quick mind, so I can analytically pull things together for sure. But there's a lot of people who struggle with not being in a system or a modality. Jungian analysis is not a modality at
So
all.
interesting. So interesting.
Mhm.
Hmm. And I guess also incredibly intuitive, right? On your
Very,
part.
very. Oh yeah, I have lots of synchronicities will come up before or other sessions, or I'll have like images or like sensations emerge that I listen to while I'm with people that just pop in. Even that moment when I thought of trapeze, that it's those moments. It's that kind of
Hmm.
allowing, to the point sometimes people will be like, can you repeat what you just said? I'll be like, nope,
Yeah.
nope. I don't know where that came from.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's super interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I,
I'm sure you experience that too. Yeah.
yeah, and in teaching this work, you have to be able to kind of live inside every moment with the actor to experience what they're experiencing and to know how to support them. A huge part of the work that I do is not just knowing what to say, but when to shut up. Right?
Oh my.
Knowing what not to say. Uh,
Uh,
because a lot of acting teachers think it's their job to point out all the mistakes. No, 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 wrong, 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 right?
mhm,
And
mhm.
in our work, Demidov tells this beautiful story of it's a like famous, I think, German tale, fairy tale or something, of a town of fools who build a house and they build it without windows or doors. So it's dark inside. And so they build a tunnel inside and they try to remove all the darkness. They fill sacks with darkness and take it out and empty the sacks. And
Mm.
of course, the darkness does not disappear. And then a hero figure comes and goes in, sees the problem, and lights a candle, and the darkness disappears. And
Mm.
Demidov says, for us as teachers of this work, it's not our job to, point out the darkness because it will just be filled by more darkness. Our job,
Ah,
our job is to bring a candle.
ah. You know what that reminds me of? Is one of my supervisors who's a sound play therapist who's also from the UK but based in Ontario, my former supervisor. She always was like, so when I do dream interpretation, people often, and they have trauma histories, their associations are always like the dark, to
Right.
the darkness, to the immediate, like, this is my trauma history, this is my suffering. And something she always reminded me of was, where are the green shoots in the dream?
Right.
Like, where are the green shoots? Where's that? What's poking through, even if
Absolutely.
it's a really difficult dream? Like, where is the kind of the self-regulating function of psyche poking through? And so
Hmm.
it's, yeah, so Freud, getting back to Freud, Freud would be much more about like trauma and cause and effect and looking at dreams to diagnose, neuroses or pathology instead of like what's coming into being,
Where's the
right?
green shoot? Hmm. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I always
absolutely.
try to remember that,
Yeah.
because the dark is so obvious sometimes, isn't it?
It is, but it's also, you know, the thing I love about that is just that we are constantly, it's not that we don't point to places that the actor can do better, right? But you do it in a way that is, I always say that these little so-called what we might call mistakes are actually gifts from the unconscious to us. They're
Mm.
they're pointers, and if we just look with curiosity and never with judgment or criticism, just,
Mhm.
oh, how interesting this happened. I
Mhm.
felt like speaking here and I didn't. How interesting. And we keep that window open, right? Rather than self-judgment, criticism, which closes everything down and the brakes just slam on harder next time.
Mhm.
So it's a really interesting thing that why I love this work so much because it's about lifting up, lifting that person up until they're flying on their own.
Mhm.
And then there is no need for me for even for the technique, right?
Mhm.
It's yeah, it's been a fascinating process, and of course, like you, I'm still learning, right? We are in a constant process. There is never any finish line.
No, no, that's why I can't systematize anything. Even when I was a movement coach or therapist, you need to create a system. I'm like, I can't. What? It's like writing a book. Would you write that book 3 years after? No.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
it's um
It's
yeah.
it's constant movement, right? It's in everything's in constant flow.
Well, it's very contagious hearing you speak, you know. It's very contagious. Like, I can feel into that like enlivening, life-giving experience that you try to share with other people.
But that's what I get from your work, Jane, right? That's why I wanted to speak to you so much because I really feel that connection, that resonance.
Mm.
So look, we're going to have to finish up, but I just wanted to say thank you so much, and I would love to speak to you again in the future if you are interested in coming back to have a conversation with us.
Of
Uh,
course, yeah.
and it would be lovely to meet you in person one day, also.
Absolutely. I wish I'd found you or the Demidov method when I was acting. It would
Yeah,
it would have been a very different experience.
me too.
Mhm.
I wish
Mhm.
I'd found it a lot earlier myself.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Well,
Well,
thank you so much, Jane. And I really appreciate the conversation, and I hope to speak to you again soon.
absolutely. Have a good rest of your Saturday.
Thank you very much.